Hi, welcome back. Our previous lesson was on market structure. Today we'll be moving on to setting prices when you have market power. This will be the first part of it, and our next lesson will be on part two. Figuring out what price to charge is one of the most important business decisions firms have to make. There are many sellers who face a trade off between selling a larger quantity of items versus making more money on each item they sell by charging higher prices. Because we typically have a demand curve that is downward sloping. We have our quantity here and our price here. We observe that there is a negative relationship between price and quantity. So there's usually a trade-off between selling higher quantities or charging higher prices. So this trade-off arises because if sellers set prices too low, their profit margin will disappear. However, if they set prices too high, then they'll barely sell anything because people will move on to their competitors to buy from them. So figuring out how best to evaluate this trade-off is going to be a lot easier once we've introduced two analytical tools, which is the firm's demand curve, which summarizes their market power, and then the marginal revenue curve, which measures a firm's incentive to increase production. So let's start with the firm's demand curve. So what is a firm's demand curve? So a demand curve simply summarizes the quantity that buyers are willing and able to demand from a particular firm, and it shows that this varies as you change your price. So the shape of a firm's demand curve is determined by their market power. So what do we mean by this? We saw in our previous lesson what we mean by market power. The fact that a firm is able to increase the price of a good above the competitive level without losing a significant amount of its customers. So let's start from perfect competition. We mentioned in our previous lesson that perfect competition has no market power because there are many sellers and they are also selling identical products. So if a firm has no market power, as in the case of perfect competition, then what does this mean? A slight increase in its price will lead to a loss of all its customers. So because you are many and then selling identical product, we saw in our previous lesson that perfect competitive market, they are price takers. They do not have the power to influence the price. So a slight increase in their price will cause people to move to the competitors. So in this case, if a firm even increases its price slightly above the competitive level, they won't sell anything because all the customers will go to the competitors. If it lowers its price even by a penny, it will win all of its rivals' customers because everyone will buy from them, and this will boost its sales enormously. So what we have here is that in a perfect competitive market where they have no market power, the firm's demand curve is usually flat because any slight change in price lead to an enormous change in quantity sold. So as we said, the price is usually fixed in this market because a particular firm doesn't have the power to influence the price. They just charge the prices that is given in the competitive market. So their demand curve is going to be horizontal. So you can see that at this prevailing price, they can produce or sell as much as their production function allows them to, but then they cannot influence the price by increasing or decreasing it because of the perfect competition. Now, if a firm has a lot of market power, in the case of monopoly, so we know that monopoly is the other extreme cases, and between perfect competition and monopoly, we have the oligopoly and monopolistic competition, which they have some degree of market power. So if we look at monopoly now, where a firm has a lot of market power, then what is going to happen to their demand curve? In this particular market, because the firm has very high market power, it can raise its price without losing all of its customers. So remember, what we mean by market power is the ability for you to raise your price above the competitive level without losing all of your customers. And the two things that account for that is your share of the market, and then the level of differentiation of your products from other products. So in the case of monopoly, we know that they are the only sellers in the market, and then they sell unique products because in a particular market, they are the only ones selling the product that they are selling. So because of these two factors, they have very high market power. So when you're a monopoly, you are the only seller in the market. And in this case, the quantity demanded from your firm is the total quantity demanded of the entire market, because you were literally the only person supplying that market. So as a result, a monopoly's demand curve is also the market demand curve. So that's what we've shown here. So you know, in a perfect competitive market where there are many firms, so we have firm 1, firm 2, firm 3. So the market demand is simply the demand for firm 1, the demand for firm 2, and then plus the demand for firm 3. That gives you your market demand. But in monopoly, where the firm is just the only firm in the market, so the firm's demand is simply the same as the market demand. So even though a monopolist has no competitors, a higher price will still lead the quantity demand to be lower, because consumers will still have some option of not buying the product. So we are not saying that because you are the only person in the market, you can charge any price and then nobody will have an option but to still buy. But consumers have the option of either not buying your product or reducing the quantity that they buy of your product. So monopolies cannot just charge any price infinitely as they want. So that's why we have a downward sloping demand curve for the monopolist. So to be able to increase the quantity, they have to be reducing the price per unit that they charge. In between perfect competition and then monopoly, as we've already stated, we have imperfect competition, which is monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. So a firm in imperfect competition has some market power, but this is limited. Unlike sellers in perfect competition, firms in imperfect competition can raise their prices without losing all of their customers. Unlike a monopolist, firms in imperfect competition face some competition, and so raising their prices will lead to a loss of the market share. Now, the shape of a firm in imperfect competition demand curve is influenced by its market power. If you don't have much market power, then your demand curve is very elastic. And elastic, as we mean here, is just flatter. So we are going to just look at this curve to explain what we mean by what I just said. So we are looking at low versus high market power. Let's start with those that have low market power. So if you do not have market power, then your demand curve is very elastic. So what do we mean by this? So in this case, raising your price slightly will sharply reduce the quantity you sell. So this curve shows firms with low market power, and then this shows firms with high market power. So if we start from point P star, so at this price, assuming you're producing quantity Q1. So let's represent this by point A. So this is for both the firm with high market power and low market power. Now let's see what happens when there's a change in price. If any of these two firms, both of them or any one of them, increase their price to P prime. Let's begin with the firm with low market power. So the firm with low market power, because of the increase in price, consumers will reduce their demand. So this moves the quantity from Q1 to Q3. So this is the reduction in quantity as a result of the increase in price. Now we can see that if we look at the curve with high market power, the same increase in price is going to move quantity from Q1 to Q2. Now we see that the decrease in quantity for firms with high market power is much lower than that for firms with low market power. This is because if you have low market power, your curve is elastic, which means that a slight increase in your price is going to cause people to reduce the demand substantially. And this is mainly because you have a lot of competitors and then other people selling identical products. But then if you are a firm with high market power, your demand curve is more inelastic. Now, this means that you are the kind of producer that has less competitors and selling a bit of differentiated product. So even though people might reduce their demand for your good, it will not be as drastic as if you have low market power. So this is all that we have on our lesson on the first part of setting prices when you have market power. And next lesson, we'll be looking at the second part. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.